Hi, I'm Bill Wilt of Assured Research. Thanks so much for dialing into this discussion of workers' compensation and specifically the impact of the decline in opioids, the prescription of opioids and workers' compensation claims really over the last now 10 plus years. Again, I'm Bill Wilt of Assured Research. We are following up on workers' compensation. Our September Assured briefing had a substantial note on the topic, and it's also recorded as a video at this YouTube website. So feel free to go back and look at that if you haven't seen it. In our September briefing, we examined the impact of rising medical costs, now a reconstituted medical trend line, not the medical CPI, but that reconstituted medical trend line is rising or has been rising, and that could negatively impact margins. We're watching the relationship between wage inflation and medical inflation, and it could have an impact, meaningful impact on reserve redundancies, which have been substantial in workers' compensation. Again, more on that in our September briefing and a separate video at this YouTube site. Here we're focused on the decline in the use of opioids, which is an unadulterated positive for injured workers, for society at large. But you can imagine that there is, we suspect, and conversations point to as well, some natural resistance point, some point at which the decline in opioids will begin to diminish, and there's some natural resistance point where there is some level of opioid prescriptions, particularly for serious workers' comp injuries, that's going to remain in the system. And actuarially speaking, it's interesting to consider the kind of the financial rate making and reserving ramifications of the shape, the way in which that decline has happened. So that's the real focus of this analysis. And first, before we get to the slides, are many thanks to folks at the Workers' Comp Research Institute who have not only been studying and documenting the change in opioid prescriptions and the intensity, that is the amount of opioid prescriptions per claim, for over a decade, but they helped us go back through all their work and kind of carefully pick out in the end what was 8 specific studies that we strung together to analyze that change. So bear with me just a second as I share my screen, and we will get right into the few slides that we have here. Good. Now hopefully you can see that. There we go. So we have 2 slides taken from the WCRI's 8 reports. These first 2 slides cover their 5 reports referred to, are all having the title Interstate Variation in Dispensing of Opioids, where they study the frequency of opioid prescriptions in non-surgical claims. That's on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, they're studying the intensity, by which we mean the amount of opioid prescriptions, the amount of opioids prescribed when a painkiller or when an opioid was prescribed. And you see both very positive trends. First, the frequency is going down. The interstate variability is remaining about the same, as you can see in the boxes on the left, but certainly both the mean and the median are declining. From 2006, looks like the peak was maybe around 2010, and down to this is claim year 2016 with prescriptions through 2018. On the right-hand side, you see the intensity of opioid prescriptions is really not only declining sharply, but the interstate variability really diminished. Some of those outliers, particularly to the upside, heavy levels of opioid prescriptions when opioids were prescribed, that really came down through regulation and political pressure from the insurance, property casualty insurance industry, professionals, and the medical profession as well. So really positive trends. When we move forward, the last 3 studies ranging from 2020 to 2022, the WCRI changed their orientation, so we have to change the way we present the information. But here we show that as percentage of all workers' compensation prescription claims, the amount of dollars spent on opioids from early 2016 to early 2021, also, pardon me, also declining nicely, although, and here's the crux of the issue, um, sure looks like the rate of decline is slowing, and you might pick somewhere in late 2018, early 2019 to say, gee, the rate of decline has really started to flatten out. Still going down a little bit, but the pace is declining. Now, we don't know the resistance point, and we suggest that there probably is some natural resistance point, because opioids, when used and prescribed properly, we suspect are an important component of treating the pain of people with serious injuries. So this isn't about squeezing out all opioids in workers' compensation claims, but the premise here is that at this point, as we sit here in 2023, we're going to surmise that the majority of any unnecessary, or in air quotes here, excess opioid prescriptions, which were clearly happening in the 2010s and shortly thereafter, that most of that excess has been wrung out of the system. Now let's look at the financial ramifications of this process. I should take a step back, because I don't think I shared that the studies which we cite in the research note from various sources have shown that workers' compensation claims, when an opioid is prescribed, are meaningfully more costly than those with like injuries where no opioid is prescribed or alternative pain medicines are prescribed. In fact, the duration of temporary disability claims is something like 3 times longer when an opioid is prescribed versus not prescribed. So if you'll just allow, we're going to say that claims, comparing similar claims, one with an opioid prescription and a meaningful opioid prescription, is meaningfully more costly. So that's the crux of this, is then that as opioid prescriptions have decelerated rapidly from the peak in, call it 2010 or thereabouts, through late 2018, early 2019, those costs would have had a really favorable impact on workers' compensation loss costs. That's part of one of the drivers we suspect that you see here on the left-hand side, where what we've done is taken industry workers' comp ultimate loss and ALAE, put it on a per employee basis. This is nationwide. It's got lots of measurement issues, but it probably provides a reasonable representation of the broad trends, which is to say that in the early 2000s, losses were higher, maybe a bit more variable, but look at the way they kind of sort of peaked in the 28, 29, 2009, 10 timeframe, and have really come down. Those are the dots, ultimate losses per employee. The blue line looks at a 4-year moving average, and we share that because it's kind of sort of an approximation of the experience period used by the NCCI as we look at some of their rate filings and just based on information and belief, and it shows that rapid decline in workers' compensation losses per employee outpaced the moving 4-year average that would have been used for pricing purposes, or would have formed a basis for pricing. Full recognition that there are other factors, favorable trends driving those losses lower, benign medical inflation, frequency was declining year after year. But we think, based on everything that we see here, that the rapid decline in opioid prescriptions and the intensity of opioid prescriptions was a major driver of that sharp decline in loss costs. And you see how in around late 2018, or call it 2019, 2020, those losses per employee began to change. Perhaps in part they stayed low, but perhaps in part they've stopped decelerating, because most of the opioid the excess prescriptions of opioids has kind of run its course and been wrung out of the system. So the difference between those dots and the blue line, that manifests as really favorable loss reserve development. And you see our bracketing and the check mark here to compare the years where the blue line's above the dotted line on the left and how that translated into really favorable reserve development on the right hand side, which arguably appears to be running its course. So there's good news. The good news is that the excess prescription of opioids, that much of that problem has been addressed. To make my point, I'll go back here. The less good news is that meaningful tailwind to workers' compensation claim costs appears to have largely run its course. Now we'll end with this observation. Actuarially speaking, if we're right about this kind of natural resistance point, if claim costs simply glide down and meet that natural resistance point, say let's say claims with opioids, doesn't necessarily present a problem, because we're not trying to make the case that opioid prescriptions will go higher from these low levels. But there's always, like anything in life, action and reaction. There's always a risk that opioid prescriptions could go a bit too far, and that they'll bounce back up, at least some, because again, they are part of a treatment regimen and pain regimen for those who are seriously injured. But perhaps more notably, to the extent that actuaries anticipate that loss costs will continue to decline at the rate that they have for the last several years, if they're baking that trend in, or changing their experience period to kind of to manifest a continuation of that trend, they could be in for a negative surprise, because it sure feels like the loss cost per employee are probably starting to even out, and perhaps even rise. So there you have it, our thoughts on workers' compensation. This was in our October Assured briefing, so if you're a subscriber, you'll have access to it. If you're seeing this and you're not a subscriber, we'd welcome the opportunity to put you on a trial subscription. So again, thanks for your attention, and we'll look forward to coming back to you with more content in the near future.